What is going on? Stand Up Nation. What's up, guys? Thursdays, am I right? Um, Hope everybody's doing well, feeling well, staying safe, um, and not ruining it for the rest of us. I don't know what that means. Things are starting to open up. Um, they're going to allow fans at Yankee games, so that's a good thing, right, guys? So hopefully this will be the last semester that I have to do these videos for you to ignore. Um, so here to talk today about Edward Murphy. I don't even know if his full name's Edward Murphy. Um, I went through your comments as usual, solid. I appreciate all of your input. Um, so I'll start with some of my thoughts and some of the stuff that we um, that came up in class last week. Um, and hopefully you get something out of it. So Eddie Murphy, a little background. Most of you know um, his background. He was just such a huge star in the 80s. And I know I've said that about a lot of comedians that we've watched so far that, oh, they were huge, blah, blah. He was the real deal. As Evan mentioned, he was the rock star. I would agree with that 100%. Um, but it's sort of one of these phenomenons like you guys know him as Donkey from Shrek or the guy from Daddy Daycare or Norbit or Doctor Doolittle or Christmas with the whatever, a litany of movies where he dresses up in a fat suit. um, that's your Eddie Murphy, which is a totally different version of Eddie Murphy than I grew up with, right? Um, Beverly Hills Cop, Coming to America, The Golden Child, Trading Places, and basically saving, literally, not even basically, literally saving Saturday Night Live. It was on the verge of being canceled in like 1981, maybe? And he came in and everybody was like, holy shit, who is this kid? He was 19. So that's also a piece of information you should know. He was 22 when he did Delirious. And in 83 and then in 87 he did Raw. So it's interesting to look at those two back to back because it represents sort of 4 years of growth. I don't know that there was much growing going on with men in the 80s, but um, you can decide that for yourself. But it's interesting, like he was 22. Like some of you are probably 22 or almost 22. So he was that kind of virtuoso in comedy and definitely a rock star. Um, so I'm just going to go through some of my notes that we went over in class, that we talked about in class. And it was funny, we got talking, and I mean, we barely even touched on what is, I think, one of the greatest bits in the history of stand up in terms of it being funny and timely, but it's also it sort of links this comedy lineage, stand up lineage a little bit, which was the Cosby bit. Um, I'll get to that, but I'm like, holy shit, we haven't even talked about this, and we're still, there's only 5 minutes left or whatever. So the one thing that stood out and that we focused on a lot, that if you watch the Dice Clay Kinnison stuff that was from this week, like Allison, you brought them up. You must have watched them in a funky order, um, which is fine. Um, this was almost tame compared to that in terms of the misogyny and the homophobia and just this just sort of ignorant, um, the ignorant uh, outlook on the world, but specifically marginalized communities starting to make progress. And I think when that happens, this is the question that I posed the last couple classes. Like, why, when that happens, do we, typically white men, but men in general, because we've been in power for so long, why is our reaction to marginalized groups seeking rights or equality or, a fair shake? Why is our first instinct to defend our masculinity as if that's what's being threatened? It's to defend it and squash it out instead of be open to it and figure out how everybody can move forward. Um, it's a I I don't know that anyone has answered that question, but these comedians, these shock comedians, and that's what it was. This was shock comedy. Eddie Murphy was the onset of shock comedy, and he was he I think made it. He popularized it. Let's put it that way. And what I mean by shock comedy, I mean it was a huge movement in the 80s, and I think most of the movement, if you want to call it the movement, is defined by this fear, this male fear of um, or growing communities. Um, and he was the best at it because everyone loved him for it. Um, and then we watched Dice and Kinnison. They were kind of like, oh, we can do that now. And then they're doubling down on the shock. And shock comedy is, for me, just being shocking for the sake of being shocking. Which, as someone mentioned, like, who was it? I can't remember. Um, Someone mentioned at some point, and I brought this up. Maybe it was Jackie. Um, yeah, it was Jackie. Um, like shock that shock value only works for like a few minutes or a few jokes. Then you realize, oh, this guy's just gonna try to say the thing that no one will say out loud or whatever, and that there's a short shelf life for that for the most part. And this is what I've been pushing the whole semester. Is like you gotta continue to grow and continue to talk about different things and explore different avenues. And you know, the guy who finds and sensationalizes a thing and then just does that, keeps doubling down on that, in this case, shock comedy, that's going to fizzle out very quickly. So I wrote a bunch of things down. Murphy's misogyny and homophobia are an indication that each of these groups were becoming a threat to traditional masculinity. And it plays out not only in his jokes and his, you know, his tone, but the fucking the suits. He's these leather suits. Like Eddie Murphy thought he was a god, and the ego on the guy was enormous. He thought everybody wanted to fuck him, of course. So he had this whole sex symbol thing that he was cultivating too. So it was like the leather suits were just like, yeah, everyone wants to fuck me, you know. So like even his whole macho attitude thing was just like, I have to defend this. And I don't know, maybe you didn't get that feeling. I think the general consensus in class was, yeah, this felt different, right? And a bunch of your comments used this idea of the difference between bringing awareness and targeting. And I think that was a great way to sort of frame it. Liz, Tyler, and Jules all mentioned it specifically. This idea that Carlin Pryor seemed want to bring awareness to these ideas and issues and groups or whatever, and Murphy seems to be targeting women, targeting homosexuals, and I that resonated with me. I think that's a good way to put it and a good line to draw, a good way to evaluate sort of a comedian and his or her performances. Um, so yeah, it just begs the question like, what are you afraid of? Like, are you really afraid of women becoming more powerful? Right? Are you really afraid of getting fucked by a gay guy? I don't I don't get it. Um, but I like the Delirious, the opening gay bit in Delirious. I think he's 22 and it's 1983. Like people didn't think about it the way they do now. They didn't, you know. Um, I guess it marks some sort of progress. Um, but he tries to condition the joke at the end, right? He says, "Oh, I'll hang out with gay people. There's nothing wrong with them. You can do things with them. Just when you leave, you go do a straight thing, and he will go do a gay thing, and that's fine." I think there is an element that Murphy is working through these issues. He just is fucking on an island, just doesn't know what to do with it. Um, but that seems to be this underlying current of his is like we need to we need to stop this. People need to, and you stay in your place, homosexuals, stay in your place, women, um, and people are just eating it up. Like that's what I said. They're talking about this shit like it's perfectly normal. Like that was kind of frightening, and I can see that being jarring for any of you guys through the 2021 lens, looking back and being like, holy shit, dude. Not only is he saying these things, he's not being booed off the stage, right? He's being applauded and like vigorously applauded for it, for saying these kind of negative things. Um, you know, it's almost like he's lamenting the days when women knew their place, right? Even a couple you mentioned, the who mentioned it? Sonia mentioned the domestic violence stuff when he talks about you used to be able to just remember when you used to be able to just hit women. And everyone's like, yeah, like even that bit, you can feel him sort of struggling with it. But he's commenting on he can't do that anymore, and women are stronger now. Like that's, I think, an attempt to make good comedy, to make a joke and make it something more, but he never really follows through on it. And when you don't, it comes off as, you know, damn, I wish those were still the days, you know. Um, so there's a bunch of you were talking about how, oh, his jokes were more surface than the other comedians. Like, that might be true, but I don't think you can never paint anyone with an absolute brush. Like, oh, and none of Eddie Murphy's jokes were meaningful. Well, that's just not true. They all weren't, but certainly not none. Not none. Yeah. Um, but a bunch of you guys commented that he blends those two better than or more than the other guys that we've watched so far. Um, Blending comedy and good comedy. And he talks about sex and shit a lot, but he also sort of weaves these things in together, and I think that's a valuable assessment of it. But you know, he talks about racisms in Delirious, and similarly that Pryor does. Some of those jokes are really mirror each other. Like when he's talking about black guys today in 1983, he would be like, I don't give a shit about. I would have told the slave owner to suck my dick until you got one crack of the whip. You'd be like, oh, okay, that whole everybody's tough until they're in the moment, until they're faced with it. The same way Pryor talks about the Nazis. Like black guys would be like, oh, it's these fucking Nazis, and then they're like, oh, excuse me, until you're there, you can talk all you want. But the part about Delirious I thought was interesting was he talks about what racism can do to people, right? When he is going to Texas, and they're all like, oh, be careful in Texas. Like, they don't like black people. And he's like, I showed up as black as I could be, right? Leather medallions, and I came off, and someone just said, I was looking for racism. And that's what it can do to people. Can I take your bag? Is this your bag? Yeah, it's my fucking bag. Like, it makes you on edge and combative and sort of, um, you know, skeptical, I guess, of anybody. Um, I thought that was interesting. Um, I didn't mention this in class. Why he's wearing the ring outside of his glove on in Raw? I'm like, that just bugs me. Wearing gloves in general, and then wearing a ring outside the glove. I don't know what that was. Um, Back to this. I think Raw is more defensive than even Delirious. So if you picture it this way, Delirious is this 22-year-old kid skyrockets to this comedic fame. He's like, I'm going to do my own special, and he's just out there, just like doing what got him there. So now you have 4 years in between. You have some time to reflect, and things are changing and all this stuff. And I feel like he dug his heels in and was like, no, fuck this. These women need to know their place. And this is how you do it, guys. And these homosexuals need to know their place. Like, that is just something I can't wrap my head around. And maybe neither he could. He couldn't either. But Raw feels defensive. He seems terrified, right? He's terrified that a woman's going to take all his money. He's terrified that, a gay guy is going to come after him. He's terrified of all these things they're going to happen, you know. And this kind of goes back to, who was it? Caitlin's comment about, and this is a valid point. It depends on how you look at it. She saw his jokes about change, being his way of dealing with it, I guess. And there's a lot of stuff out there about this idea. Like, when you joke about it, you're, it makes it less scary or less intimidating. And you can, maybe that's part of how you accept change. I don't, I think Eddie Murphy has changed. In fact, I think Drew maybe mentioned it. A couple of you mentioned in recent years, or since those two stand up sets, he has publicly apologized for some of his comments about AIDS and things like that he just got wrong. And so maybe that is maybe that's what's happening here. That jokes about change make that change feel less scary and intimidating, but it's hard to look away from the defensive nature. He's not just talking about it. That's what I meant. That's back to like targeting and raising awareness and targeting. Like that seems to, those two ideas are fucking each other a little bit. And I'm not sure. I just get the feeling that Murphy was targeting, not raising awareness, or not trying to work through or make it less scary. But no, it's equal. Both interpretations are fair. So the Cosby bit is just, it analyzes Pryor, Cosby, Bruce, Chappelle together in a single bit. Right? Like it's amazing. It's amazing. Right? So it's critical of Cosby being critical of him, which is a fair argument, right? Because Cosby was as guilty of this as anybody. Cosby's whole thing that we talked about was giving a different representation of blackness in America, what it means to be black. But he kind of goes against his whole philosophy when he says that there's basically, if you're going to be black, you should be like me, not Eddie Murphy. He thought Eddie Murphy was setting the race or the community back by being vulgar and hypersexual and, being Eddie Murphy, basically. Right. So Murphy, I think, digging his heels in again and being like, no, fuck you. I'm going to sort of cash in on this. So neither is wrong because neither of them realize there's no one way to be a thing, which I've mentioned, a few times this semester in all my classes. I think there's no one way to be a thing. It's like if you're black, you're black, no matter what you do. White, the same across the board. So part of the problem was that idea. Like Cosby was like, you're doing it wrong. You're bad for our community. This is how you do it. And bringing up, ideas about race and in America very subtly. So there's the Cosby. He obviously he does the Pryor impression. He says he wanted to be Pryor, so it makes sense that this is. I mean, that this is how he faces the public with the leather suits and the cursing and just the realness, as it were. So he ties it to Pryor there. Then he uses Cosby's kid in the anecdote as like a call to Lenny Bruce, right? Lenny Bruce complained about people showing up at his shows and only retaining the vulgar language and the shock, basically the controversy, and coming home. He says, taking it to the court judge. What was the show about? Shit, piss, tits, blah blah blah. Well, that's not a show. And Lenny Bruce is like, right, let me do it for you. So here's Cosby taking the word of his son, who says, filth, flarn, filth. Right, suck my big black stuff, as it were. And that's a direct correlation to that, the whole Lenny Bruce um, experience that he went through. And Eddie Murphy says, like, you can't just do a show that's just cursing. No one would pay for that. Although, as Andrew Dice Clay would teach us, yes, people will pay for that. Um, so, and then Chappelle, the whole thing about language, right? Um, he doesn't want people coming up to him. No, people misinterpreting his act, calling him the N word, and thinking it's cool to do that. Chappelle went through the same thing with Chappelle's show, and he talked about it. So that bit is it's just it's a it's a trophy for the Stand Up Nation course, teaching this course. It's a touchstone to look to in terms of sort of framing, 30 or so years of comedy in a single bit, and the complexities of race and representation and language and all these kinds of things. So that's that's a pretty cool bit. Murphy wanted to be Pryor, not Cosby, so it totally makes sense that they would have that conflict. Now, I don't know. Some of this stuff doesn't make sense to me that I wrote down, but interpreting a move toward equality as vindictive, right? So women, he's like, oh, it's great that you are becoming more business minded and applying yourselves that way, but why do you have to be so vindictive about it? I'm like, no, I don't think that's what is going on here. Like, women don't want equality because of you, right? Um, and I think Lydia brought it up in class. Um, the irony of Eddie Murphy complaining about gay guys like checking him out and objectifying him, and he doesn't like that, and then turning around and objectifying women, not realizing that maybe they won't like that in much the same way that he doesn't, which I think is a cruel irony. I said we would be in a different place as a culture if men could let go of their own insecurities. Like, a lot of this gender stuff that we're going through and sexism is just that. Men are fucking insecure about their masculinity or whatever. I don't even know what. Insecurities in general. Or back to what I said at the top. Like, if we could just, greet this change or this growth with open arms rather than closed fists. That's one of my go-to sayings, right? This is how we usually meet difference. It's like, oh, fuck you, push it away, defend, 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 when we should open our arms and embrace it for the most part. The culture is changing around him, and I think he feels like they're coming for him. And this was a popular feeling. And this is lashing out at it, right? Citing Madonna and Janet Jackson, right? Material Girl. And what have you done for me lately? Like, see, like, women are, yeah, this is what it's about. But not really not really looking into it to see what it's about, um, making it completely superficial. I think that's all I have. Women unifying is a problem for him, right? Offended by women asking for the bare minimum, right? It's fucked up that I need to have a job for a woman to be interested in me. Like, come on. Um, so your comments, I think I touched on most of them because that's how I do it. I like, oh, I'll give you the word. Bonus word for today is going to be shenanigans. Shenanigans. Bonus word. Use it in your comment on this post and get good time bonuses. Extra credit stuff, like good stuff. Shenanigans. Drew's comment about apologizing and thought this was a good point. It's as important for people to forgive as it is for people to apologize. Right? So, concerning Eddie Murphy, years later, looking back, when asked, he apologized for. He didn't say he regretted it, but I think he said he apologized um, for whatever it was. And I think cancel culture is like, that's fine, you're still done. Like, I think I think this is a fair point, right? It's important. It's as important for those of us, especially when it comes to like telling jokes. Like, right, if you're a rapist or a murderer, it's not enough to just say, "Oh, I I'm sorry." Like, "Oh, okay, forgiven." Like, you know what I mean? We're talking about in this case with cancel culture. It's as important for people to forgive those, you know, missteps as it is for the people to apologize in the first place. Um, and Maggie mentioned how there's not much risk involved in these jokes. And I'm like, you know what? You're right. There would be today if you were doing these jokes because the cultural climate has changed to such a degree where it's risky to go out and just be a complete asshole, you know, for your career's sake. But at the time, compared to Carlin and Bruce and Pryor, there wasn't as much at risk. And that was shock comedy. Like there was nothing at stake for most of these guys that sort of defined the shock comedy wave of the 80s. Um, so, yeah. Sonia brought up domestic violence, like his bit on domestic violence, which I mentioned before, but um, Murphy for me represents how good ideas can get lost between the cursing and the shock value. Do you know what I'm saying? And this is where some of you came in with. He blends the two together, comedy and good comedy. But like, I think a lot of times, especially for stupid audiences, which you know there are, um, I think I think he's an example of that. Like, you can miss the ideas. Like for anyone who said, "Oh, his jokes are surfacey" or whatever, you can miss the ideas amidst the shock and the cursing and the antics. Um, and you have to strike a balance somehow. Um, Bringing awareness versus targeting, joking about change makes it less scary. And then Manny's comment about this was just a thing that triggered the thought in my head. You used the term tackling the issues. I go, is he really tackling those issues or is he just mentioning them? Because I'm all for tackling the issues, but to me, tackling is a much more involved process than just mentioning. And he seems to only just mention these things for shock value. He's not really digging into them and tackling them. I mean, like and that can end up being a good way to sort of evaluate this kind of stuff. Is like, is he tackling and really trying to get to something, or is he just mentioning it to mention it and be like, oh, this will get him riled up? I think there's a difference, and I think you would also agree. So it's Eddie Murphy. Coming to America 2 just came out. So you can check that out and cleanse yourself of all this. But good talk.